$12,000 or $14,000 a year. They're talking about $5,000. To some people, that's more than, it's almost a third of their income. Some it's more.
Absolutely.
And but yet, why that amount? You know, we've got to ask ourselves that, Mr. Speaker. So let's find out. Let's find out where the $5,000 came from. That's all we're asking.
I bet the Minister of Finance wanted a lower amount.
I wouldn't doubt that the Minister of Finance, my good friend from Timberley Prospect, says he probably wanted a lower amount, and he probably did. But that would be the purpose of the 6 months, that we could find out, and maybe he'll just say, "Look, I give up." You're right. You're absolutely right. When I think this through, $5,000 is silly, and as usual, that the leader of the New Democrat Party is right. It should be zero.
That's right.
That's what he'll say. It should be zero. It should be zero. So that's all we're asking for, Mr. Speaker, is 6 months to hoist this bill and to make it so that Nova Scotians can have their involvement in it. Let's not pass the bill and then have an all-party committee to look at something that, where's the checks and balances there? If it's already, the bill's been passed, and so we have no way of stopping that. There's no way that, we're asked today to look at this all-party selection, and we don't know what the fundamental issues it will have to face. But yet, the government wants us to do this. So we ask the minister, I think, in a very fair way, all we're asking the minister to do is to consult Nova Scotians. Just he can do a select committee now, and they'll report back within 6 months, and we have it. I don't know. I'm sure that we probably had more real concerns over what's going to happen when we came into the new millennium with clocks going crazy and all that, than if we don't pass this on by December 31st. That the sun will come up on January 1st. Nova Scotians will come home from their New Year's Eve parties on New Year's Day, and they will enjoy themselves, and we will continue to go forward. And so there's no real reason that why December 31st has to be the be-all, end-all. There's more. 6 months from now would be May 20th. I'm sure the Liberals will have a new leader by then. They could participate in it. I don't think that's fair. Do you think that's fair? That we're asking a leaderless party to accept this? I don't think that's fair to them, Mr. Speaker. I have too much respect for them. They should have a full-time elected leader to vote. And 6 months would give them that. 6 months would give them that, Mr. Speaker, because I'm a Karen guy. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, we don't. That's right. The leadership candidates over there that are possible. Over there. Oh, over there. No, Mr. Speaker, this is 6 months out. 6 months out, and we could find a lot of things, but not that. We're not going to have a huge problem if this bill isn't proclaimed on New Year's Eve of this year. That people will, if this bill is not proclaimed, people will still go out to parties. People will still wear those silly hats. They'll blow those silly horns. I'm sure some will even look at Dick Clark. But it will happen. This too shall pass. So, why are we so worried about this? That's why. That's why we don't understand this date. And that's what we want to find out from the minister. Why is this date so important? And why is $5,000 so important? Why is it that why you want to put an add-on here about this all-party committee, but yet don't bother soliciting thoughts from any of the House leaders? Why wouldn't you say that this is what we want to do? These are questions that I think if we ask Nova Scotians, they would want to know. But yet, what we're being asked to do here is everything that this bill purports that's supposed to stand for. This bill, what the legislation being asked to do today is actually against this. We're not talking about transparency. We're not talking about openness. What we're talking about is literally ramming a bill through that was brought in the very last days of this session, brought forward to be considered by people in a rush that was not given to the Electoral Reform Commission, was not given to all three parties in advance, but nonetheless, what it was is, here, do this. And it's your last kick at it. I can't think no more of it than the analogy of trying to a major purchase and you're putting a deadline on it, and there's no reason for you to do it. So, Mr. Speaker, 6 months, 6 short months would give us and give Nova Scotians plenty of time to decide what to do with this bill. I think the government wants to do the right thing, and that's why we're willing to give them 6 months to do so. I don't think anybody over in those benches are bad people, and I would think that's the right thing to do. So, Mr. Speaker, that we have 2 choices here in the next few days, and those choices is to have us continue our hoist motion, which we're more than willing and prepared to do, and because we don't take this position lightly, Mr. Speaker, that we're willing to move this forward. The other one could be that the government could do take up the challenge as put forward by my leader, and look at real reforms, look at real initiatives to move this bill forward, and we can get this signed off on. But unless government decides that it earnestly wants to do those things, then we're going to be here for a while. And I mean, it's our duty as MLAs to take this bill and to expose it to as much scrutiny as possible, Mr. Speaker, because this is not, as it stands, a good bill for the people of Nova Scotia. We have money in here. We've got ill-gotten, illegal money in this bill that we're trying to sanitize, and that's wrong, Mr. Speaker. That is very wrong. Nova Scotians don't want to do that. Mr. Speaker, the other thing here, Mr. Speaker, is we have to go to zero base. Zero for everybody. Then everybody's equal. Then, Mr. Speaker, and only then, will this government really know what's going on with this bill. We all have to start with the same set of rules. And Nova Scotians will like that. Nova Scotians will say, look, there, we're starting to get our belief in democracy restored. That these parties all agreed on this. That you start with zero, Mr. Speaker. And until we sit down here and say, get rid of the trust funds, everybody, all three parties start with zero. That's the only way that we will get back to Nova Scotia's good graces. That's what this government has to do. Be smart and do that.
Thank you. The honourable member for Hands-Fife.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad to have an opportunity to speak. Unlike a former member of this party who was a former member of this House, I guess I'm still a present member of the party, who used to rise and say, I'll give a few brief comments and go on at length. I won't say that I'll give a few brief comments, but I hope to go on at length. And Mr. Speaker, my colleagues, I think, have all spoken very well on this motion to set this bill aside and to examine it for 6 months in some fashion, and then bring it back to the House. And I think my colleague from Cole Harbour Eastern Passage stated, and others have stated as well, but he talked about poor voter turnout, and that 6 months we could engage the public as to the reasons for the poor voter turnout, and just determine the level of cynicism in the public. And I want to just speak to that for a second, Mr. Speaker. And I don't know if you're familiar with the cartoon that shows 2 deer, and one of them has a target on their side, and the other one, the caption of the other one is "Bummer of a birthmark." And so in this case, Mr. Speaker, what I see are two deer, each with a target on their side, but one's a Liberal and one's a Conservative, Mr. Speaker. And for them, Mr. Speaker, both these parties, the third party and the government party, are going to have to wear this bill, Mr. Speaker. So all the more reason in their best interest to allow for a 6 months hoist of this legislation to go out, to listen to the public, because, Mr. Speaker, it should be, I think, obvious that if, in particular, this issue around allowing the Liberal Party to make use of the trust fund, something that's been spoken about in this House of Assembly before, then for the Conservative government to allow this in a piece of legislation, in other words, to endorse the actions of the Liberal Party in this regard, certainly shows, I think, both parties have a target and placed on them, and the public is not going to forget that, Mr. Speaker. So the question about cynicism and whether 6 months hoist could actually address the cynicism of the public, well, I think we'd have to maybe go down memory lane. Well, the member from Cape Breton South is saying, what cynicism? Yeah, we are, actually. We are concerned about the cynicism of the public. And I think all politicians should be concerned about it, Mr. Speaker. And why wouldn't politicians be concerned about the cynicism of the public? And I'll take you for a walk down memory lane, Mr. Speaker. And let's just look at how the public has been dealt with successive governments in this province. Well, certainly the previous Liberal governments wouldn't deal with the trust fund issue, and the public has been aware of that. So when in 1999 the John Hamm government came in, and some of the first things that government did was attack charities and the disabled, paramedics, and Bill 68, which was regarding the nurses. And if the member from Hammonds Plains, Upper Sackville, was listening to me as I introduced my discussion here, he would know why I'm going down this road in regards to the hoist. So, Mr. Speaker, in 1999, we had a new Conservative government. In 2003, that government came back with a minority. Now, they came back with a minority and even lost a minister, lost a couple of ministers, and certainly one around the Digby Quarry issue, which the government was unwilling to listen. So we talk about cynicism of the public. So the question of whether or not a 6 months hoist of this piece of legislation that is supposed to reaffirm or confirm or somehow have the public engaged in a discussion about electoral reform, then we would have to know whether or not they think there's any purpose in that. That this piece of legislation, they have to have a buy-in. Now, this government, in its forethought or insight, for whatever reason, didn't believe that sending this to the Election Commission was worth doing. And I think this adds to the cynicism of the public, Mr. Speaker, because I think that the public generally believes that the wheels of government move slowly. I think they believe that in order to get anything done, it takes a long, long time. But yet, when the government wants to do something, when the government wants to bring in legislation, when the government wants to pass that legislation, something they want to do, Mr. Speaker, they can do that very quickly. And this bill and Bill 68 are examples of what the government has tried to do very quickly. It didn't take them any time to draft this, to present it to the House with the hopes of getting it through the House. So, Mr. Speaker, if we're going to have a buy-in from the public on this bill, and all the more reason to take this to the public and find out what they're thinking in this regard. And I think that would be a worthy a worthy approach on behalf of this House, not just on behalf of the government, I think on behalf of all members of this House. And I would say, Mr. Speaker, I mean, would the public have any real reason to be cynical of this government? I mean, you know, before public accounts the other week was the head of Conserve Nova Scotia, and all of the questions around that. And I think the public certainly would have questions around the appointment of Heather Foley-Melvin. And would that make the public cynical, Mr. Speaker? So for 6 months, yes, we can go to the public for 6 months, Mr. Speaker, and see what their thoughts are on this. And if they are cynical, then all the more reason to come back to this piece of legislation and have the public input that is needed to redirect this legislation to a way that the public actually has buy-in, Mr. Speaker. And I think that's what the government has forgotten. And actually, I'm surprised by the Minister of Finance when he talked about a committee to go around the province after the bill passes. And I'm not really sure if the minister is putting the cart before the horse in this regard. Maybe at some point he'll get up and add his comments to this debate as to why he wouldn't want to do the consultation with the public before he introduced the bill rather than after he introduces the bill, because I would say the chances of the government coming back to this House and making changes to this bill after it's gone through the House are fairly remote. But there is the possibility, although a slim one, that we actually could go around the province, get input from the public, and change this bill before it gets any farther through this House, and then maybe have a better bill for the people of Nova Scotia. I mean, something that's not in this legislation that I think Canadians have said on more than one occasion, and I know people that I've talked to in my campaign in June, Mr. Speaker, because we've had a number of elections in a short period of time. And I think that people would really look forward to an opportunity to speak to the issue of fixed election dates. So if we're going to go around and talk about an act that affects financing of election campaigns, well, let's broaden that horizon a little bit and talk about the issue of fixed election dates, because I think the public would have a stomach for this. I think they're tired of going to the polls. I think they're tired of going through this process every couple of years. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the members opposite for their help. So what would the public say about this piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker? What would they say about the timing of this legislation? And I think if we were to go to the public, some people might say that this piece of legislation is a stop the NDP bill. I think some of the public would say, for the first time in this House, the New Democrats have 20 seats, and the Liberals and the Conservatives 19.
For the record.
So, Mr. Speaker, it would be interesting. It would be interesting to know what the reaction of the public would be to this legislation. And you know, Mr. Speaker, it would be interesting to know what the reaction by the Liberal Party is to this piece of legislation. It seems to impact them in a significant way. They have a leadership race coming up in April now. They've set a date at least for that. So nobody has thrown their hat into the ring yet, but certainly names are being bantered about. And I think it'd be for the House and for the Nova Scotians, I think they'd be really interested to know what any potential leadership candidates are thinking in terms of trust funds and what this legislation means in basically endorsing the present Liberal Trust Fund. And actually, it's not clear to me that this piece of legislation would open the door for that to happen again. So I think that Nova Scotians wouldn't be too impressed about that. I think that they would really like to see some action on the part of the government, especially quick action, if the government can move so quickly on this piece of legislation, that would actually close the loopholes or shut down this particular trust fund, and also see to it that no other one can ever be created in a similar way. So sure, electoral reform would be great, financial reform would be better, and if Nova Scotians are to believe that there is some ounce of democracy in this House of Assembly, then they probably would want to know that all parties act on a level playing field. This piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, doesn't do that. All the more reason for a 6-month hoist so that we can actually go out and discuss this with the people of Nova Scotia. And it would be really interesting just to see what the media has to say about it even tomorrow, what's been introduced in this House and their perception of how that's going to affect elections in the future. So, is this piece of legislation a good reason to stay in this House? Well, certainly, if it meant getting the legislation out to the people of Nova Scotia to find out what their thoughts are, then that would be reason enough. I think that we tend to not think often enough about who put us here and why they put us here, and I think that people in the last election indicated their disdain for the political process and for politicians because of their numbers they turned out to vote. I mean, Mr. Speaker, if Nelson Mandela spent years in prison so that people in his country could vote, and yet people in this country who've had a democracy that they can vote at every election, that's all they've really known, then how is it that they don't see that as a mechanism to making their lives better? If they don't see the electoral process as a way to at least get new vision or new ideas, and actually, I guess this past election might be one of the most recent elections in the history of this province, Mr. Speaker, where the government actually took an idea and ran with it that was one of our ideas. So I think the public pretty well made the statement they'd rather see the real New Democrats than the false New Democrats, and put New Democrats in with more seats. Mr. Speaker, I think we've come to probably a stage or a time in the history of this province where there is an appetite, I think, on behalf of the public for change. I think the results of the last election would indicate that. I think this piece of legislation, although I think the government will try to sell it as electoral reform, but for anybody who pays any attention to it, I think they're going to question whether it actually changes anything or actually just nails down the problems of the past or cements them. And I think that's how this is going to be read. We're not to a place, for whatever reason, I guess, the old ways die hard in this province, and we're looking at the remnants of that thinking from both of the opposite parties to this party, and it's particularly difficult to try to sell a piece of legislation to the people of Nova Scotia that actually didn't go through a formal process, and it's one of the few that the government has done that hasn't taken a formal process, and all the more reason, I think, why the people of Nova Scotia should expect it. And I guess that the people of Nova Scotia maybe come to expect nothing different from this government at every turn when we've seen it, whether it was long-term care or whatever, that we've negotiated with the government, that what we got in negotiation and what we got in the final product were completely different things. And I think for us, certainly for the New Democrats, it would be important for us to actually have some time to have some input by the public in this piece of legislation in order to see if it's possible to reform this legislation. Change on the part of this government does not come easily, and I think at just about every turn, Mr. Speaker, we have seen that issues that we thought were important to Nova Scotians and the interpretation of those issues by us, Mr. Speaker, compared to the interpretation by the members on the government side have been completely different. And I know the government is going to try to sell this piece of legislation as an improvement. I think they're going to sell it based on equal terms. And I think they might even have half a case when it comes to the limitation of donations in terms of unions and corporations. They might have been able to sell it based on that, but they couldn't sell it based on allowing the Liberal Party to make use of its trust fund. That was a wrinkle that they should have taken care of, and I would think that if they were to go to the public, they would find that out. And when I started my discussion, Mr. Speaker, and I talked about the two deer with the targets on them, I think that's an analogy that they would be well advised to listen to, because I think that the public is going to view this present piece of legislation, the way the government has presented it, as one that has been a deal cooked up by the Liberals and the Conservatives. And
Order, please. It was earlier today that I ruled that word as unparliamentary, and I asked the honourable member to retract it. And again, I would remind the member to please speak to the motion of the hoist.
I'll retract it, Mr. Speaker, and I'll say that it's a piece of legislation that the Liberals and the Conservatives cooperated on, and to get the product that was to get the product that was presented to this House. And I think that for Nova Scotians who went through yet another election in June of this year, and I think, as we would hope, they would hope that it would be an election that would bring about some real change in the province. I think this piece of legislation indicates how little we've changed, Mr. Speaker. I think this piece of legislation indicates how little the government has changed. And I think, regrettably, for Nova Scotians, I think it indicates how much the Liberals and the Conservatives are the same. So, in other words, it indicates how little the Liberals have changed, a party that is in third place, that has lost seats, and yet, even in their dying days, they refuse to change for the benefit of the people of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Now maybe, I'm thinking about a 6-month hoist, Mr. Speaker, to try to improve this piece of legislation. Maybe that would improve the thinking of the Liberal Party. Maybe there'd be a benefit. Yeah, my colleague from Halifax Fairview is saying that will take us past the Liberal leadership race, maybe a leader with some new ideas. We can only hope, that would certainly be something that people would notice in the Liberal Party if they had a new idea. So Mr. Speaker, could there be a real benefit in going around the province, discussing this piece of legislation with the people of Nova Scotia? Then yes, I would say, and certainly, if nothing else, I would see it as an action that would show, number one, that the government actually might be interested in listening to the people of Nova Scotia. It would force the government to stand around this province, in the communities in this province, and explain to people what it sees as the merits of this legislation and to convince the people of Nova Scotia of the merits of this legislation, which I would think they would have a difficult job doing, Mr. Speaker. And I guess I can only conclude from that, if I think that, is that would be the reason that they would be against taking this legislation around the province, to set it aside for 6 months, and to have the people of the province give their views on this piece of legislation. Now, good idea. Now that would mean certainly that the members from the third party would also have to explain their views on this, which they, to this point, have been unwilling to do. And I guess I should suspect that as this debate moves along, Mr. Speaker, we're going to have a tough time hearing comments from the members of the third party. So, that as this debate moves along, Mr. Speaker, we're going to have a tough time hearing comments from the members of the third party. And they would be the ones that actually, I think, would be wanting to explain to Nova Scotians their use of legislation. Now, Mr. Speaker, I can't think of a better reason, you know, with all the possible things that the public might say around electoral reform and certainly financial reform of elections, but they certainly, I think they certainly would want to either air their views or hear the views of the government and the Liberals on why they would think that we would have to write a piece of legislation, why we'd actually put into statute their ability to use that trust fund. Now the question, since the government didn't come to us, which I think is odd, Mr. Speaker. I mean, I think that New Democrats, and I thought the members on the government side, and maybe the member for Truro Bible Hill will stand when I'm done, and he'll answer this question for me. But I was of the view that the work that we did in this House prior to the election in June, Mr. Speaker, actually to the work we did in this House prior to the new Premier being re-elected or being elected by his party, the work we did with Premier Ham, that Nova Scotians thought that was good work, and that the fact that the Conservative Party in government tended to consult with the New Democrats on issues, I think Nova Scotians thought that was good work. And I think they thought that there were some good things came out of this House. Now, we never got all we wanted, and we think the government never got all they wanted, but that's the art of compromise. But now, Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives have got to try to explain to Nova Scotians why this alliance with the Liberals is good for Nova Scotians. And Mr. Speaker, they could have 6 months to try to make that case, but you know, Mr. Speaker, it wouldn't take that long, Mr. Speaker, and it shouldn't take that long. In other words, it should be obvious from the work in this House that the parties on this side can work with the party on that side, and that is not going to be particularly clear to Nova Scotians. Actually, I think Nova Scotians are going to wonder about this, and all the more reason, Mr. Speaker, to take this on the road and to find out what Nova Scotians think. And I can understand why members on the government side and from the Liberal Party would be somewhat opposed to doing that, because, Mr. Speaker, they've got to defend the indefensible. They're not going to be able to explain this legislation in terms of being beneficial to the people of Nova Scotia. And that is what we think legislation that comes through this House of Assembly is supposed to do. It's supposed to work to make the lives of the people of the province better. It's supposed to make the democratic process better. And we have no evidence, absolutely none, that this piece of legislation is going to do that. So, but I'm expecting at some point, one of the ministers or one of the members from the third party will get up and they'll explain their views on this legislation. They won't leave it entirely to the Minister of Finance. He was the one who introduced it, but no, that's my leader is confirming what I'm saying, that they won't say a word, and it's a shame, Mr. Speaker, that it's a shame that they're unwilling to show Nova Scotians what they think. They're unwilling to actually have a debate that backs the legislation to show that this is good legislation for the people of Nova Scotia. And I mean, I guess it's the actions of the government in one hand to kind of ignore the wishes of the people, and then to ignore them in such a great way on a piece of legislation that affects the democratic process is, especially, Mr. Speaker, if you could think of the June 13 election and the Conservative government coming back with a large majority, if you can get your mind around that, if that happened, then you could actually see them drafting a piece of legislation that they could get through the House, that they wouldn't need any help from the opposition, and it would kind of show that they believe that they had a mandate from the people to carry out that legislation. But actually, Mr. Speaker, since 2003, when this government has gone to the people, it's come back to the House with fewer seats, which is a message from the people to say they don't like the direction this government has been taking, Mr. Speaker, and for whatever reason, the government side of the House has refused to listen. Now, Mr. Speaker, I think people, the public generally, would say, well, and they say it in a cynical way, I think, that when they refer to the opposition, they would say, your job is to oppose. And they say it in a way that even if the government does something that's good or right or that we could agree with, we'll oppose it. And our job actually is to improve legislation. If we think the government hasn't gone far enough or hasn't done it right, that we think with our advice we can help them out. But you know, Mr. Speaker, in this particular piece of legislation, and I guess if we can't do it, then the public could do it. If we take this legislation, set it aside for 6 months, go to the public, maybe they can do what the Liberals are unwilling to do. I mean, the Liberals are unwilling to take their role as opposition and to actually try to make this legislation better. And I guess, Mr. Speaker, you have to say, well, you know, they obviously seem to be getting a benefit from this legislation, so why are they going to do that? So they've actually abandoned their role to stand up for the people of Nova Scotia by joining in with the government side on this piece of legislation. So the real job of opposition has fallen again to the New Democrats. I mean, in the last House, or since 2003, it was the New Democrats that set the agenda and forced the government to move on so many issues. And actually, in the 2006 election, the public recognized that, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, they did.
Now, for a party that has lost seats in the last election, the government side, they have a perfect opportunity to say, we're going to turn that around. We're going to listen to the people for once. We're going to carry out policy that actually the people have shown an interest in, and we're going to direct our bureaucracy to move toward the people. And this could be their first step, Mr. Speaker. Actually, you know, Mr. Speaker, you and I both know how this works. I mean, the government doesn't have to go out to the people for 6 months and to get consultation. The government could actually write a piece of legislation based on our advice or based on advice from the Liberals that they actually could improve this legislation and bring a bill to the House tomorrow. That could be a better bill. But I think, Mr. Speaker, they're not going to do that. And I guess you have to start to ask yourself, after 2 consecutive elections where the government side has lost seats, at what point do they actually start to listen to the people? because there hasn't been any issue that has been big enough, strong enough, important enough to actually make them change their path that would show that they listen. Now, Mr. Speaker, maybe this is the issue. I don't think they're there simply because of their reluctance to address this piece of legislation here today. No members from the government side or from the Liberals have been willing to engage in this debate, which I think seems to be an odd thing. Certainly an odd thing from an opposition party not to engage in this debate. I think we're used to the process enough that members from the government side don't debate us when it comes to legislation in the House. And I think the public actually believes, Mr. Speaker, that they do. I think the public believes that when a minister stands up and introduces the bill, makes his comments on the bill, that a member of the opposition will get up and he'll debate those comments, and then or then a member from the government side or the other opposition party can get up and give their comments, and we have this back and forth. But any of the public, if they come to this gallery, they will see that that's not the case, Mr. Speaker. The government side doesn't debate the legislation. As a matter of fact, I mean, I think to a point, we all might understand that in terms of a majority government. When the government side has the majority of the seats, we can expect that they may not engage us. But this is a government that doesn't have the majority of the seats. This is the government that has lost seats in 2 consecutive elections, and yet it's one that refuses to stand and debate a piece of legislation. So this, I think, kind of goes, if there are things about electoral reform we want to change, Mr. Speaker, and take 6 months to discuss those, then maybe we want to include in that debate, legislative reform. Maybe we want to include the rules of the House around how we move legislation through the House. And I'm assuming that the members opposite would be wanting to speed up this process, and I think that takes some compromise, Mr. Speaker, on the part of the government in comparison to the members, certainly to the members on the official opposition. It doesn't seem to be any great desire for debate on the
The honourable member for hand seats allowed introduction.
Certainly.
The Honourable the Premier.
Speaker, and to the member for giving up a moment of his time. I'd like to draw the attention of the House to the the Speaker's Gallery. I guess we are in, Mr. Speaker, to welcome to the House of Assembly the Member of Parliament for South Shore St. Margaret's, obviously a friend to all, a special friend perhaps to one particular person that sits in the chamber. But I'd like to ask Gerald Katie to rise and receive the warm welcome of the House of Assembly.
Indeed, welcome to Member of Parliament Keddy. The honourable member for Hants East has the floor, and thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to welcome the Member of Parliament to the House of Assembly myself. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure if the he might want 6 months, yes, and I'm not sure if the member for Chester St. Margaret's may hear better from that vantage point, but if so, that's a good thing. So, Mr. Speaker, what will come of this legislation? Well, I think we pretty much know from the reaction from the government side that they're certainly going to go through the process. From what I can tell, they're going to let this party certainly speak to this piece of legislation. I think that if they had a plan for when they wanted to be out of this House, and they probably recognize that may have gone down the drain. And now, with that said, Mr. Speaker, they could probably hit their targets if they were to hoist this legislation, set it aside for 6 months, allow for a debate with the people of Nova Scotia, and then bring it back in the spring. And hopefully, as a result of that, bring it back as a changed piece of legislation. If it's the government's view that this can't be changed, or they're unwilling to change it, then I would say yes, probably that's the way it would come back as the same as it is. And I think that they'll use whatever powers they have in the process to ensure that the bill gets through the House in its present form. And I got to say, Mr. Speaker, that I think for Nova Scotians, when they start to read about this piece of legislation tomorrow or the following days as this debate goes on, I think they're going to have real problems with it. And I think that the limit, the up to $5,000 for unions and corporations, I think they'll see that as perhaps a move in the right direction, but not a move far enough. And I think when the member for Cole Harbour and the leader for our party rose and spoke to this piece of legislation initially and moved the motion, I think that what he said would be the best way to go, and that would be to ban donations by unions and corporations. And I got to say, I'm curious as to why the government actually appears to be unwilling to go down that road, Mr. Speaker, since their federal counterparts are more willing. And so it's a bit interesting that a Conservative member of Parliament will be here for this debate, Mr. Speaker, when the federal Conservative government is actually moving farther than this provincial government on this piece of legislation. So it would be, and we can only assume that member supports the federal legislation, and so maybe he can impress upon his provincial colleagues the necessity of moving this legislation a bit further, and I'd really like to know his reaction to that. So maybe we'll get to find that out yet. So, Mr. Speaker, I know people would, and I guess probably all the members of this House probably believe that a week in politics is a long time, but 6 months in politics need not seem so long, Mr. Speaker, and especially if they think that good work is being done, if they were to leave this chamber and go find out what it is that Nova Scotians think about this legislation. Now, we could say that perhaps the government is somewhat leery of doing that. Perhaps the government is worried about getting an earful. Maybe the government is worried that they won't be able to control that process, and from start to finish, when this legislation comes back to this House, that they are the ones who are going to wear whatever it is that the public has to say about this. But, Mr. Speaker, I think better to wear it then and change it than to not change it and wear it for 6 months. And I think that's the risk that this government is taking. And, Mr. Speaker, sometimes I look at the things that the government does and I would say, well, they won't do something like that again because it has had no positive benefit for them. But yet, just about the time you think you've seen it all, you see something like this piece of legislation. I mean, we had questions in question period the other day, Mr. Speaker, and it was around the lack of a contract for a payroll contract that had gone out, that had no tendering done, and it's up, its costs have increased over $20 million. We have farmers in the province who are looking for money from the government, not looking for $20 million at all, and so you say to yourself, wouldn't these be simple things for a government to deal with? And yet they won't. They don't deal with them. I mean, they seem to drive their allies away and embrace people who are not their friends, and yet to do them absolutely no good, politically. And the people of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, are not embracing this Conservative government. So at some point, Mr. Speaker, you would start to think they are going to do something or bring in legislation that the people are going to stand up and say that was a really smart thing for this government to do. But Mr. Speaker, Bill 117 is not that legislation, is not that smart thing. So you have to wonder why that would happen. And I guess I can't really go down that road because, well, if the minister's going to give me an opening to go down that road and not say I'm impugning motive, then maybe I can. But so, but I wouldn't count on it. Yeah, that's for sure. So, but Mr. Speaker, I mean, I think if we were the members on the opposite side, if the New Democrats were in government, then we would want to bring in legislation that had a positive outcome. At least we would think would have a positive outcome for the people of Nova Scotia, but we'd like to think would have a positive outcome for our party politically. But I don't see that for the Conservative government in this case. And actually, I don't see it for the Liberal opposition. I don't see an upside to this legislation. And so maybe the Premier or someone from the Liberal Party, maybe someone who's aspiring to be leader of the Liberal Party, they could maybe stand up and address this piece of legislation in some way that would actually show some direction that would show a benefit to the people of Nova Scotia. And if they're not willing to do that in this House, maybe they'd be willing to travel around the province, Mr. Speaker, and voice their ideas to the people of Nova Scotia. I mean, these committees, if we strike this committee the same way we strike the rest of the committees of this House, then certainly it would have equal representation by all parties, and that would give all three parties ample opportunity not only to speak to it, but it would certainly give them opportunity to listen. And that's the part that seems to be missing, certainly from the government side, because we know right off the start that they didn't listen. I mean, if they were going to listen, they would have sent this to the Election Commission, and they didn't do that. Completely bypassed it. And the Minister of Finance, I see him shaking his head at my comments, so perhaps he'd be willing to address why they short-tracked this to get it to the House. And actually, maybe someone can explain why at this late date they brought this to the House. I mean, if this was a piece of legislation they wanted for some clear debate, I guess that debate is only going to come from one party. Why not introduce it in the first week when we came back to the House? Like, why introduce this in the dying days of this session and I guess prevent input? So the government obviously sees this as a hill they're willing to die on, I guess. So you got to ask yourself, Mr. Speaker, why would that be? Like, what is the upside of this piece of legislation for the government, and what is the upside for the people of Nova Scotia? And it's not clear. It's not clear from the bill. I think the advice by our leader would be appreciated by the people of Nova Scotia for sure. And I think if the Minister of Finance introduces this as to make a level playing field, then to ban completely donations by unions and corporations would be a much more appropriate way to go. I think it would send a clearer message to the people of Nova Scotia, and it would be probably a way to start a dialogue that would get some compromise from the members of the New Democratic Party to see this piece of legislation get through the House. Now, it's obvious that to compromise and dialogue, these are not things that the government side is interested in doing, Mr. Speaker. I mean, they're willing to sit. They're willing to, I think, listen. A few are, but I don't think they're willing to change this. I don't think they're willing to change this very much, Mr. Speaker. And I think all the more reason to engage in this 6-month hoist, see what the people of Nova Scotia have to say about this. Since the members opposite don't seem to have much to say, but they might get a message from their constituents that would, speak more clearly to them. I mean, we live in the world of politics. We tend to worry a little bit about how happy or not our constituents are. If our constituents are giving us a strong enough message, they'd like to see change, then that's usually enough for politicians to tend to move in the direction of what their thinking is. And we know that to ignore that, you do that at your peril, Mr. Speaker. And I think that's what this government has done in the past. That's what this government has done in 2 elections. They tried to run roughshod over the people of Nova Scotia, and they didn't let them forget it. I mean, the government came back as the party in power, but it had lost members. And that's a very good reason for them to think about what legislation they bring before this House and what the reaction of the people of Nova Scotia is going to be to that, because if they haven't learned anything, they should have learned that much by now. So, Mr. Speaker, again, I say all the more reason for a 6-month hoist on this piece of legislation. So if they're going to listen to the people of Nova Scotia, that's the opportunity. We would have thought that last June would have been the perfect opportunity, and they didn't deliver a clear message. And this piece of legislation is not going to do that, Mr. Speaker. Now, I would have to say that if reform is what this government is interested in, then they should be interested in making some real change. There's no evidence, no evidence in this piece of legislation, and I think the thing that maybe New Democrats find most galling about this legislation is the fact that we are being asked in the House of Assembly in Nova Scotia to endorse the Liberal Party making use of their trust funds in legislation, where we are asked to endorse their taking public money to use in whatever way they deem fit. And actually, those dollars were actually taxpayers' dollars or consumers in Nova Scotia, and they deserve a benefit from that, and they have never received it. And that party should return those dollars to the people of Nova Scotia so that they clean the slate. And for the government in a minority situation to ask us to agree to that, Mr. Speaker, it only makes me wonder what the government is thinking. I mean, how can the government go through 2 elections, lose seats in both those elections, and then bring a piece of legislation to this House that addresses an issue that for years they have railed against? In other words, the government side have railed against those trust funds by the Liberals, and now they bring a piece of legislation that says it's okay for you guys to keep them. And they think there's going to be a benefit from the people of Nova Scotia, from the electorate for that kind of thinking? It is hard to understand. So there has to be a payoff. Like, what is it? Like, what is the reason that people would expect, that Nova Scotians would expect, that this legislation would be good for them? And how can it be good for the Conservatives or for the Liberals? And I come back to my original comments about both parties with a target, on them. I mean, you're asking your constituents to agree that those dollars, which would be referred to as ill-gotten gain by the Liberals, is okay. That after all these years of politicians standing in this House and commenting against that type of action, that you expect us to give up our responsibility to our constituents and accept that. And you're willing to give up your responsibility to your constituents and accept it. And Mr. Speaker, I don't get any clear indication from the government side as to why they expect, certainly us, on this side of the House and the official opposition, to agree to that. And I don't hear anything coming from them that trying to convince me this is a good reason because there can't be a good reason for that. I think Nova Scotians have spoken on that before, and they've made it clear they don't like this. And I come back to my original comments about cynicism. Why is it that we had such low voter turnout? Is it because the people believe, and actually one of the hurdles that New Democrats face in election time is is that we get painted with the same brush as the other parties. I mean, people say you're all alike, even though New Democrats have never governed the province. So, Mr. Speaker, why would they expect us to stand in our place and say that this legislation is a good thing? Because it's not a good thing. It represents what we fight against every day in this House. I don't understand why the government side is not fighting against it, Mr. Speaker. So maybe, now, Mr. Speaker, and you may disagree with me, maybe 6 months we would get a clear indication of why the government sees this to be an appropriate piece of legislation. But I find that hard to believe. I find it hard to believe that this government can make a case to the people of Nova Scotia, because they certainly haven't been able to make a case to the members on this side, why this piece of legislation would be good legislation for Nova Scotians. I don't see it. I'm willing to listen. But I don't even hear the member from Truro Bible Hill anymore. He was quite engaged in my my presentation earlier, and I don't know whether I've lost him in my discussion, but certainly, Mr. Speaker, I'm hoping that when I'm done, Mr. Speaker, that member will get up and he'll engage the House for an hour. I would really look forward to that. Matter of fact, I would expect that there will be just a flurry of activity on the government side with members trying to get to their feet to address this piece of legislation, and we will look forward to anything that they have to say. But to this point, they're silent, and I got to say that I'll be interested to see tomorrow what the reaction to this legislation is, Mr. Speaker, because I think there's going to be a reaction, and there's going to be a reaction. There's going to be a reaction from the public, and I would say it's not. Well, that's good. I obviously have gotten a reaction from the interim leader of the Liberal Party, and that might mean that he's actually going to stand in his place and speak to this, Mr. Speaker, and that would be a good thing. I'd look forward to hearing that. So, Mr. Speaker, but if in the interim he doesn't do that, and I actually would be not surprised if he doesn't stand in his place and speak to this, because so far that hasn't happened, and there's been lots of opportunity. But then maybe if we were to take a committee around the province, he would have his opportunity. Maybe he'd volunteer to go on it. That he would be one of the first people out of the gate to hear what it is that people have to say, and in terms of this legislation. And I got to say, Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to hold my breath on that, but certainly it would be an opportunity for some members of the third party to go around the province and find out what it is that Nova Scotians exactly think about Liberal trust funds and what this piece of legislation does to try to legitimize the use of them. And I hope that there is a cry from one side of this province to the other that tells them that they don't like it, that this is something that was wrong from the start. And I think Mr. Speaker, it speaks so much to what people come to believe in terms of politicians, and I think that we have an opportunity to really show some leadership in this province and make it clear to people that this type of action isn't going to be tolerated. And I have to say, I regret that the government brought this legislation forward, Mr. Speaker, because to be in this House of Assembly and to not take your role here more seriously than that is well, it is sad. I mean, and I would say that I think that Nova Scotians looked at the new premier in the wintertime and thought, maybe there will be a change in how we do government here. And I think that from June, we certainly got a message that it isn't. There is no change. We're back we're back to the good old days. I mean, you know, if you look at the number of members opposite Mr. Speaker and look at the number of members who are in cabinet, I mean, you know, that's something that the previous administration would never have gone for, and you have to ask yourself, is there a benefit to the people of Nova Scotia from such a large cabinet? And I would say we don't see any indication that the government runs any better. We don't see any indication we don't see any indication that many more people around the cabinet table actually shows that, you know, that their brainstorming sessions produce any better ideas. And so, you know, it's worrisome, Mr. Speaker. And I think for the people of Nova Scotia, you know, they would have to be wondering. You know, we have one of the largest cabinets that we've had, you know, in the history of the province. We don't seem to be getting anything done in a faster, you know, better, stronger way. And you know, Mr. Speaker, I think about the campaign in June, and you know, that come to life, advertising the province that the government engaged in, and I see you know those commercials on now. And you know, Mr. Speaker, you know, it tries to express a feeling of optimism for the future and a feeling of optimism about what a great place we live in. But yet this legislation doesn't do that. This legislation just hangs a cloud over the work that members of this House do, so that, you know, we'll have to go to our constituencies and try to explain a piece of legislation coming through a House of Assembly that would legitimize a trust fund that the people have already indicated they don't care for. So, Mr. Speaker, we haven't come forward in this process. We haven't come forward in these last days since the last election. I mean, this newly minted government, we haven't changed anything. Matter of fact, I think we've taken a step backwards, and I don't know to just which generation we've gone backward, but we certainly haven't taken a view to the future. And I think for people of Nova Scotia, when they start to realize that, the government is going to have to stand and explain what it is they're doing or move away from it, Mr. Speaker. And I think that it's regrettable that the members on this side of the House will stand in their place to try to change the thinking on such an important piece of legislation. You know, and when I think about the legislation that's come through the House in this session, and you look at the impacts of, you know, and there were some goodwill bills, you know, the brook trout and so on, but even the legislation that on midwifery that I thought was a smart move on the part of the government, long overdue. You kind of think, gee, you know, they're starting to get somewhere. And Mr. Speaker, and then what do they throw into the mix? What do they throw into the mix on some legislation that people would think was long overdue, or goodwill legislation? They throw in kind of a mean-spirited. They throw in a piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, that's kind of a mean-spirited piece of legislation. I would say, it is, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please.
Thank you.
Member's time has expired. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. On a point of order, I would like to ask the concurrence of the House to revert to the order of business, tabling of reports of committees.
Request for the reverting of the order of business to the reports of committees. Agreed?
Agreed.
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
As Chairman of the Committee on Law Amendments, and direct report that the committee has met and considered the following bills. Bill number 86, an act to amend Chapter 293 revised statutes 1989, the Motor Vehicle Act. Bill number 70, an act to declare the brook trout to be the provincial fish of Nova Scotia.
Murray, I'll take claim for that.
Bill number 78, an act to amend Chapter 9 of the Acts of 2001, the Order of Nova Scotia Act. Bill number 87, an act to amend Chapter 92 of the revised statutes 1989, the Consumer Protection Act. And Bill number 113, an act to amend Chapter 1 of the Acts 1994 and 95, the Environment Act. The committee recommends these bills in favorable consideration of the House with certain amendments.
Order that these bills be referred to the Committee of the Whole House on bills. The honourable member for Halifax Fairview.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker,
That's not nice at all.
all I said was thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I'm very much reminded of the time when I first entered this House back in 2001. In fact, you and I, Mr. Speaker, entered this House on the very same day, which reminds me of a very funny story involving John Leaf. But I'm not going to tell it now. I'm going to save it for another time. Because I have to say that that story is not about the principle of the bill, Mr. Speaker. And you know, it's strange. I've been here now for over 5.5 years. And after only 5.5 years, I counted it up one day after the most recent election, Mr. Speaker, and you know that you and I are in the exact middle of experience in this House. 25 of the members of this House have been here longer than you and I, Mr. Speaker, and 25 members have been here for less time. So I find and there's tremendous turnover in this House. This must be the first time in a long time, Mr. Speaker, that the most senior member of the House has been here for only 13 years. And I say only. I mean, let's be frank. I mean, the member for Cape Breton South and the member for Clare have been elected 5 times? 5 times in 13 years, which is quite an accomplishment, Mr. Speaker. But I would think that it's relatively rare in this House that the most senior members have been here for as little as 13 years, because for the previous generation, we've had people like the former member for Cape Breton Nova, Paul McEwen, who I can name now that he's not in the House, or the member for Hants West, Ron Russell. And Mr. Speaker, every time you call on the member for Hants West, I still expect Ron Russell to stand up. Mr. Speaker, of course, we welcome the new member for Hants West. My point being only that when you see a member in the House for so long and have such a distinguished career, it becomes a bit of a surprise when you call their constituency name and they're no longer here. But this was all leading me to the fact, that, Mr. Speaker, that within a few months of my entry into this House, we were launched into the debate on the famous Bill 68, where the government tried to take away the right to strike of a very large number of healthcare workers, and we, the opposition, tried to prevent them. And what happened then, Mr. Speaker, in 2001 was that we had a majority government at the time. And so we knew that if the government was determined to pass that bill, that they could, but we were not going to make it easy for them because it was the wrong thing to do. And today, Mr. Speaker, despite the fact that nominally we have a minority government, we find ourselves here in the NDP in exactly the same position. We find ourselves with the government members allied with the Liberal members, so that in effect on this bill we have a majority government. And so we are going to do what we have to do to draw the attention of the people of Nova Scotia to how wrong this bill is in principle, Mr. Speaker. And what I wanted to draw to the attention of the public and of Hansard, for the record, Mr. Speaker, is the fact that after every single NDP member speaks, the members of the Liberal Party have an opportunity to stand up and speak, an opportunity which they so far have not taken. And members of the government have the opportunity to stand up and speak, an opportunity which they so far have not taken. This is what debate amounts to in the Nova Scotia House of Assembly, is when the government makes up its mind what it's going to do, this time with the third party, they fold their arms and wait for the clock to tick by and wait for time to run out. And I guess we're going to find, Mr. Speaker, how determined this government is, how resolute they are. How far is this government willing to go to defend Liberal trust funds? That's what we're going to find out. And Mr. Speaker, as was so eloquently pointed out by the Leader of the Opposition, we should mince no words about this. Those trust funds are the proceeds of crime. Let us not call them anything else. People were criminally convicted and sentenced over those funds. They are the proceeds of crime. How far is this government willing to go to give the Liberal Party the opportunity to legitimize the use of those funds and to try and pretend that somehow they're clean, somehow they did not originate in a crime against the people of Nova Scotia, because it is the people of Nova Scotia who had to pay higher liquor prices for decades. It is the people of Nova Scotia whose government had to pay inflated contracts because 3 to 5% was expected to go back to the Liberal Party of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, we're going to find out today, tomorrow, this week, next week, the week after that, Mr. Speaker, how far is this government prepared to go to defend that and to say that is the right thing to do for the people of Nova Scotia? This could have been the most important electoral reform in a generation in Nova Scotia. This could have been the most important electoral reform in a generation, Mr. Speaker. This is the first time in a long time that any serious attempt has been made to address the issues of campaign finance in Nova Scotia. And what we decide today, tomorrow, this week, next week, the week after that, Mr. Speaker, is going to affect Nova Scotia politics for the next generation. That is how important this is. Everybody in this House believes deeply in their principles, in their ideas, about what they stand for and what their party stands for. And this bill that is before us will go a long way to determining whether we are able to act on those principles and those ideals and what we all want to accomplish for the people who sent us here. It could have been the most important electoral reform in a generation, a tremendous opportunity to clean up politics in Nova Scotia, which I have to say, Mr. Speaker, is not held in high regard across the rest of Canada. And if you want to have proof of that, just ask other people across Canada what their view is about politics in Nova Scotia. For too long, Mr. Speaker, our politicians have been known for things like patronage, things like trust funds raised from kickbacks, Mr. Speaker. For too long, that's what Nova Scotia politicians have been known for. This was our chance, now that the issue of campaign finance reform is on the government's radar, to clean it up properly, to do it right. But they didn't, Mr. Speaker. This bill falls so far short of what was possible that it is simply impossible for me and my party to support it. Mr. Speaker, it could be so much better. The Leader of the Opposition, in his very eloquent address this afternoon, has said there are two reforms that we ask for. This bill needs to be changed in two ways, and then we will accept it. And what we need to do, Mr. Speaker, is reduce corporate and union contributions to the political process to zero. Mr. Speaker, that is the most important one. We need to reduce union and corporate donations to zero. That is our challenge to the Liberal Party. That is our challenge to the Conservative Party. Just a quick statistic here, Mr. Speaker. The other parties love to play to the stereotype, of course, as the NDP is getting large donations from the trade union movement, Mr. Speaker, something which I'm quite proud of. I very much believe in the value and necessity of trade unions in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. But let me tell you something, a statistic, Mr. Speaker, that you may not be aware of, Mr. Speaker. In 2005, I love asking skill testing questions, Mr. Speaker, because typically I find the members don't know the real facts. In 2005, what percentage of the NDP's funds were gained from unions? And the correct answer to the question, the correct answer to the question, Mr. Speaker, is 13%. 13%. Now, the next question, Mr. Speaker, is what percentage of Conservative donations in 2005 came from corporations? Mr. Speaker, what percentage? Anybody over there know the answer? I didn't think so, Mr. Speaker. Do you know what it was? 51%. 51% of their donations came from corporations who can't vote. Mr. Speaker, 51%. And Mr. Speaker, as for them, Mr. Speaker, as for the third party, what percentage of their income do you think came from corporate donation, Mr. Speaker? Was it 13%, Mr. Speaker? No. Was it 51%, Mr. Speaker? No. It was 59%. And so they accuse us of getting large donations from trade unions, which amount to 13% of our income, and they get 59% of their donations from corporations. Why don't we hear them talk about that? Why don't we hear the government talk about the fact that 51% of their donations come from corporations? I am very proud of the fact, Mr. Speaker, that the vast majority of donations to the New Democratic Party of Nova Scotia come from individuals. They come from me, they come from the member for Hants East, they come from the Leader of the Opposition, and they come from many, many people in my constituency and other constituencies across the province. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'll tell you another fact that you may not know, but this is something that the government can congratulate themselves for. Although I am very proud of the number of individuals who donate to the Nova Scotia NDP, currently the Progressive Conservative Party of Nova Scotia has more individual donors than we do. And I say to the government, good for you. Good for the Conservative Party. You get more donations from more individuals than the NDP. So, Mr. Speaker, now, of course, I also have to add that that is always the case for the governing party. For some reason, which I can't quite imagine, once the party falls out of favor and out of government.
Order, please. The Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party on a point of order. The Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I just thought it was important that we're giving out facts this evening. And I note that the member from Halifax Fairview has chosen not to give out a certain fact, but just for Nova Scotians watching would know, in 2003, the total union contributions to the NDP was $280,000, which amounts to 49% of the total contributions they received in 2003.
Order, please. It is not a point of order, but it is a point. The Honourable Member for Halifax Fairview.
You know, Mr. Speaker, you know, Mr. Speaker, I love to provoke debate, and clearly that wasn't a point of order. Mr. Speaker, if that member has something he wants to say, let him stand up when it is his turn and let him say it. I want to know.
Order, please. Order, please. Order. Your mic's not on. The Honourable Government House Leader on a point of order.
A point of order. For the honourable member, I would like to consider that he consider adjourning debate on this bill. I don't want to interrupt his thoughts now, any chance, but by some moment, if a few minutes, if he could do that, we could then deal with the rest of our business.
The honourable member for Halifax Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, I'm only just getting going.
You've only just begun, I know.
I have hours and hours of material here, Mr. Speaker. I haven't even started on the Conservative donation list. However, it is my understanding that perhaps the House would prefer to hear the continuation of my speech when they're better rested. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, I would move that debate on the bill be adjourned.
Motion is for adjournment of debate. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I won't say our business being concluded for today, but the business that we intend to deal with this evening, I would move that the House do now rise to meet it tomorrow at 9 a.m., and the House would sit until 11:59 p.m.
The motion is for the House to now rise to meet tomorrow at the hour of 9 a.m. to 11:59 p.m. All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. We stand adjourned.